17 weeks later. Stargate Command Level 1705.0.3.2022. It had been several weeks since what was now known as the ambush of the Terrans had taken place. The dead had been buried, the ships had repaired, and the debris had been cleared. But that was only the beginning. Shepard, the one from the aborted timeline, had briefed the Tory and their allies on the Terran Empire and their plans for invading the Pegasus Galaxy and Milky Way. The Colonel had not known that much about the Terrans, but the alternate version of Guide had filled in a lot of the blanks. So now they had to prepare for the coming invasion, which was why President Quinn and IOA had called for a meeting, and it was a big one. In fact, the group didn't fit in the briefing room down on level 27. Fortunately, storage room 12B was practically empty. Located up on level 17, it was the bigger neighbor of storage room 12A, which was where the Tory had negotiated their inclusion in the Protected Planets Treaty back in 1999. But now that room was filled with the stuff from 12B, while 12B itself had been turned into a briefing room. A room that was filled to the brim. All of the SG team leaders were there, both from Atlantis and the SGC itself. Besides them, all Tory ship commanders were present. To represent the political side, the IOA had sent the old F-team negotiators. There were also ambassadors to represent the Milky Way off-world allies. Completing the group were Richard Woolsey, Brigadier Kersey, and the commanders of the Milky Way off-world sites. Everybody was waiting for President Quinn, who had not yet arrived. Finally, the door opened and Quinn walked in. He sat down between Colonel Mitchell and Colonel Shepard. There was only one Colonel Shepard in the room. This was the version of Shepard that had not been to the Terran universe. After some discussion, IOA had ordered the Liberty repaired and upgraded. They had also authorized the Liberty expedition. Led by the other Shepard, this was a group of 100 military personnel and 50 scientists assigned to boost the ship's crew. That Shepard had been promoted to Brigadier General. The Resistance had also had him the CO of the Liberty, so that Tommen could focus on commanding the ground forces. Sorry, NCIS Europe has been chasing several African smugglers. The Secretary of the Navy needed to brief me on their progress. He turned to Kersey. The floor is yours, Brigadier. Yes, sir, Kersey said, before standing behind a lectern with the seal of the Air Force. We have been in contact with the Wraith. After the Liberty recovered the alternate Shepard and Banks, there was communication between them and the Grand Conqueror. The Wraith have deduced that the Terran led them into a trap with false intelligence. They have canceled their planned attack against Atlantis and our allies in the Pegasus Galaxy. The alternate Banks had joined Brigadier Shepard on the Liberty. All our intelligence indicated that the Wraith are preparing for a full-scale war with the Terrans. Quinn logged this as good news, but the look on the Brigadier's face made it clear that this was where the good news ended. As for the seeded planets, both the Pentagon and the Kremlin have been running scenarios. The outcomes have not been good. All of the tactical and strategic analysis come out the same. It will take every ship in the Tory fleet to defend Earth. We can't even spare ships to defend Atlantis, let alone worlds like Saita and New Athos. We can't leave Pegasus undefended, Shepard said. And we won't, Kersey began. The plan is to move both Atlantis and Vanaheimr to Saita. This will secure Atlantis and should make the Terrans think twice about attacking that world. And Atlantis will serve are the Saita's Stargate command. Also, with Vanaheimr on Saita, the Vanir fleet will be free to join the defend effort. Between them, our Pegasus allies will be able to defend Saita, the Genii homeworld, and New Athos. And the rest of the galaxy. We've had to evacuate both the Pegasus Alpha and Beta sites. But in the good news column, New Athos has room for a lot for people than the number of Athosians living there. Taylor is drawing up a list of planets which have populations small enough to evacuate through the Stargate to New Athos. The genii are also converting part of their underground bunker into an iris factory. Once it's up and running, they will be able to build and install 3 units per week. They've also begun reconstruction several abandoned outposts as shelters, including M5V-801. What about the Milky Way? Quinn asked. All 3 of our off-world bases have been evacuated, Kersey began. As for our allies, he gestured towards Braddock, who was here to represent the Free Jaffa Nation. Master Braddock. Kersey sat down, while Braddock stepped behind the lectern. I'm afraid the news is not well, Kersey of Hawaii, Braddock began. The Free Jaffa fleet has enough ships to guard Dakara. Dakara was the capital planet of the Free Jaffa Nation. It had been destroyed by the Ori during their crusade in the Milky Way. Reconstruction had begun in 2013 and had finished several weeks ago. And our core space. But based on our intelligence and analysis of the enemy's firepower, we will not have the numbers required to go on the offensive. What about the Takra and the new Asurans? The Takra are in the same situation as the Tori. They have enough warships to defend their homeworld, but not enough to go on the offensive. And the new Asurans will need all their vessels to secure the protected planets. As for the Lucian Alliance, they are still reconstructing their worlds. Before 2017, the Lucian Alliance had been a major powerhouse. Led by criminals who ruled by fear and violence, it had been Earth's greatest enemy in the post-Goa'uld era. And then, the new Asurans had relocated to the Milky Way galaxy. The war between the new Asurans and the alliance that had followed had been short and intense. And when it was over, the Lucian Alliance had been reduced to 8 planets. 8 planets that had been in rough shape. For the 2 years, the people of the Lucian Alliance had been rebuilding alone. There had been remains of the old guard in the wrong places, blocking outside help. But in 2019, the people had been fed up and those remains had been wiped out. After that, relief had begun slowly dripping in from both the Free Jaffa and the Tori. Alas, with the Terran invasion on the horizon, that help had dried up. But the news was not all bad. Because with the old guard gone, the new government or Lucian Alliance 2.0, as it was being called, was slowly becoming a diplomatic government. That was presuming the Terrans didn't waltz over it, which brought Quinn back to what Master Braddock was saying. What about their fleet, Master Braddock? He asked. Reconstruction has been slow due to a lack of resources. The bulk of what they have has been needed to rebuild their cities. Worse, our sources indicate that the Terrans' invasion is mere days away. The chances of securing the worlds of the Alliance are not good. Thank you, Master Braddock, Quinn turned to Kersey. What about providing the Alliance with irises? Because of their lack of ships, the Stargate is the main supply line for their reconstruction efforts, which makes the installation of irises far from practical, sir. There has to be something That was as far Quinn got before the base went to alert. Kersey made his way to a red phone mounted near the main door and picked it up. Quinn had a feeling that he knew what the general was about to say, so he simply waited for the brigadier to finish his conversation. Kersey did so and put the phone back. We just ran out of time, Kersey said. The Terrans launched their invasion. We have 5 hours before their fleet reaches Earth, sir. What about the gate? Richard Woolsey asked. Have they dialed in, like the Wraith do when they attack worlds? No, I gave the order to dial Dakara to keep them from doing so. We're using a radio signal to keep the wormhole until you arrive, Master Braddock. Ambassadors Rachel and Victor, I recommend you go with him. You'll be able to travel home from Dakara. Rachel was the Takra in a female host called Jennifer. She had been posted to Earth about 2 months after the Destiny expedition had returned. She normally spent her days in the Pentagon, where she had an office near Homeworld Command. Victor was a male new Asuran who had only arrived 2 weeks ago. Like Rachel, he had been given an office in the Pentagon. With all due respect, Brigadier, Rachel began, I can do more good here than on the homeworld. She is right, Victor said, and I'm not going anywhere either. I must return to Dakara, Braddock said. Kersey and Braddock left, while Quinn talked to Colonel Yin. Lieutenant Colonel Yin had been the commanding officer of the Sun Tzu when it had fought a supercharged Wraith Hive with the USS Apollo. When the Tria had been repaired by the new Asurans and donated to Earth, Yin had been promoted to full-bird colonel and put in charge of the Aurora-class warship. He was also the ranking officer of the Russian-Chinese fleet element, which was the Tria, Sun Tzu, and Korolev. Yin took out his radio and gave several orders. Seconds later, the Sun Tzu's Asgard transporter engaged, beaming Rachel and Victor to the Pentagon. Mr. President, if you wish, we can beam you to the White House, Yin said. Not yet, Colonel. There is a major issue we must resolve. Yin nodded. They both knew what that issue was, and that resolving this issue would be far from easy. Lucian Alliance Homeworld Government Hall, 05.03.2022, 0807. The building known as Government Hall had begun life as the Hall of the Council. It had been from here that the commanders had ruled the Alliance with an iron fist. After the war with the new Asurans, it had become a hospital. But in 2020, a brand new hospital had been opened and the building had been emptied. But the new government of the Alliance had been needed a central hub, and building one from scratch would take years. So instead, the old hall had been converted and upgraded. At the top of this new and improved version was President Ingrid Morris' office. Tilda, it's been a wild ride. Tilda, she looked out the window. The hall was in the middle of the city of Lucia, which was the capital of the planet. Originally, the planet had also been called Lucia. But to prevent confusion, the new government had renamed it Lucia Prime. So now most people used Lucia for the city and Prime for the planet. As for the status of both, things had been improving. Tilda, and then this happens. Tilda. Before the war, with exception of a few buildings like the Hall, Lucia had been a giant slum. But as the city had been rebuilt, it had changed for the better. At the same time, improvements had been made the rest of the planet as well. But now the Terran invasion was threatening all that. Tilda, talk about irony. Tilda. Are you okay, Madam President? A male voice asked. The voice belonged to Klaus Archer. An unofficial ambassador, Archer represented a group of Terrans calling themselves the Colonials. The Colonials were to the Terrans what the Takra were to the Goa'uld, an underground resistance movement. As things had gone downhill in their home universe, the Colonials had been looking for refuge, and they had found it by crossing over to the Lucian Alliance. When they had arrived in 2019, the remains of the old guard had been trying to take back power. The Colonials had provided the new order with the backup they needed. In return, the Alliance had helped many Colonials escape the grasp of the Terrans. And so, the two sides of this small pact had protected one another from their enemies. As for Ingrid Morris, she had begun as the mayor of Lucia. She had held that post until her term had run out at the start of this year. Her replacement was a man called Ryder Zeus. It had been Zeus who had gone to the Senate of Alliance and recommended Morris. Established a mere 2 weeks into the new year, it was the newly elected top of the new government. With one exception, the Alliance needed a head of state. The Senate had decided that Job would be the president of Alliance, and that Ingrid Morris would be the first person to hold that office. I'm okay, Ambassador. The admirals want you to come down to the cave, ma'am, Archer began, but they're too busy panicking to ask. Right, lead the way. Morris followed Archer out of her office and a spiral staircase. It led directly to the sub-basement, which was the most reinforced room in the building. The room had a security checkpoint and an elevator that went down further into the planet. Morris had never been to the cave, so she had no idea how far the elevator went down. It turned out to be about 300 meters. They reached the cave, which was not really a cave. Instead, it was a bunker that served as Alliance's counterpart to Homeworld Command. There were 2 admirals, each overseeing the ships defending 4 of the solar systems that made up the alliance. It's not a lot. Only 5 Haddock-class ships had survived the war with the new Asurans, with 3 more ships rolling off the assembly line since. So each solar system was defended by 1 Haddock-class ship, backed up with death gliders, Teltacs also known as cargo ships and Alkesh bombers. It was enough to keep any smugglers or pirates at bay. Talk about irony. But against a full-scale invasion, it would not be anyway near enough. All of the ships were visible on large displays, represented by green dots. At the edge of the displays, red dots represented the incoming Terran forces. Now it was only a matter of waiting until the dots met. Stargate Command Level 17, Storage Room 12B05.0 3.2022 0815. Brigadier Kersey had returned to the storage room. All the ship commanders had left, except for Samantha Carter and Colonel Yin. As for the SG team leaders, only Colonel Shepard remained. On the political side, there was Richard Woolsey and Vincent Quinn. The IOA team completed the group. As soon as Kersey sat down, Quinn got to the point. "We need a new head of Homeworld Command," he began. "Brigadier Kersey, I have decided that will be you." "With all due respect, sir, Stargate Command will be under the command of Brigadier General Carter, Brigadier Kersey," Quinn said, getting him a look from Colonel Carter. "And the George Hammond, sir," Colonel Yin said. "We need somebody to command the fleet, Mr. President." Quinn and Yin looked at the group of IOA representatives. Yesterday, the negotiator team had spent several hours preparing scenarios for fast-tracking. Glad to know that their promotions have not gone to their head. After all, the reason these people had been promoted had been their level of common sense. They had clearly done their homework. Let's see what they were thinking. He nodded to the group, and Henry Valley spoke up. "The Pentagon, Kremlin, and Central Committee have agreed that the First Fleet should consist of the Apollo, Daedalus, George Hammond, Odyssey, and Prometheus. All the remaining ships would be part of the Second Fleet. The George Hammond would be the flagship of First Fleet, and the Tria would lead the Second Fleet. Colonel Yin, you would be the commanding officer of the Second Fleet. As for the CO of the George Hammond," Valley looked at Quihan, the Chinese representatives who took over. "That person will command the ship, the First Fleet, and the fleet in general. When the commander of the George Hammond is not available, Colonel Yin would be the acting general commander. The military brass also recommends that the Spira should be given clearance to leave the solar system for special operations." "Sounds excellent," Quinn began. "Except for the key question, who do you recommend for command of the George Hammond?" "That's where Colonel Shepard comes in," the British representative Reginald Jones said. "Or should we say, Brigadier Shepard?" "Me, you want me to become a brigadier?" Shepard began. "That's a good one." Jones gave the colonel a look that made it clear that he was not joking. "What about my team? I can't just leave them, Mr. President. Who would take command of AR-1? "Taylor," Henry Valley said. "And yes, I know that she is currently a civilian and that the U.S. Air Force does not have the procedures to give her a rank. Fortunately, the French Foreign Legion's recruitment policy is more flexible." Valley picked up his suitcase and opened it. He took out a folder and handed it to Quinn. "So, one of the consistency plans we came up is the creation of the detachment of Pegasus. Once her training is complete, Taylor would be granted the rank of full bird colonel." "How many people would there be in this detachment?" "It wasn't easy," Valley said. "But we managed to scrape together enough of a budget for 37 military personnel, including Taylor. If you approve, Colonel Emigan would be in charge of AR-1. The remaining 36 would be 3 teams with 12 members, each led by a major. Legion Brass recommended that one should be posted on Atlantis, one on New Athos, and one on M7G 677. M7G 677. Isn't that the planet with the children? Yes, we believe that it would make for a good choice as a second planet for the evacuation program. That would make the planet a target for a Terran attack, Shepard said. Not if the Genii provide them an iris, and the new Asurans refresh the ZPM powering their EM field device, Boris Grankin said. And with the Legion team, there and a stockpile of weapons not affected by the field, they could train a sizable militia, which would only leave the issue of defending the planet against ships. Fortunately, we should be able to place ground-to-orbit outside the EM field to deal with that. Sounds like a good plan to me, Quinn said. Of course, it would leave AR-1 person short. But he had read Taylor's file and figured that she would make an excellent commander for the team. He also believed that she would have no trouble finding a smart and capable person to fill the slot. Tilda, of course. None of this matters if Shepard turns down the job. Tilda Quinn gave Shepard a look. Okay, Brigadier Shepard it is, Shepard said. But the look on his face made it clear that he was far from happy about leaving his team. Tilda, alas, this is war. Tilda and war meant making sacrifices. Now all they had to do was push the paperwork through before all hell broke loose. 18 The War/Earth. USS Spira Bridge, 05.03.2022, 1307. The fleet was in position. 13 ships and 1 Antarctic outpost, that was all Earth had to defend herself from the incoming Terran forces. Fleet 1 was holding position above Antarctica, hoping to draw some of the Terran forces away from populated areas and into the range of the outpost. Fleet 2 was holding position on the far side of the planet. Tilda divide and conquer, Tilda Vale thought as he walked into the bridge. He made his way to Science Console 1, where the newest member of the crew was preparing for the coming battle. How are we looking, Dylan? Dr. Dylan Calhoun turned to Vale. The colonel still couldn't believe he was Nicholas Rush's nephew. Not only did he not really look like the Scottish scientist, he had a very different disposition. As ready as we're going to get. The weapons are fully charged, the rack of nuclear missiles has been installed, and we have turned off all non-essential systems and diverted the power to the shields, which boosted the shields to 40% above normal. Sounds good to me, Vale nodded and went to the Flight Control 1. T. Zalo, how are we looking in the fighter department? We have 10 squadrons of F-302s, each good for 16 birds. T. Zalo said, and the Tria has 8 puddle jumpers ready to go. The Tria had come with 6 puddle jumpers, but Spira had carried another 2. Those 2 had been transferred before the battle. 2 teams of engineers had also installed a rack of nuclear missiles in the shuttle bay on Deck 7. It was home to 18 nuclear missiles, fitted with warheads powerful enough to take out an Alkesh with a single shot. Vale sat down in the command chair, which turned out to be just in time, because a series of beeps from Calhoun's console indicated that time had run out. Here they come, Calhoun began. I'm reading 60 Haddock-class ships and a lot of Alkesh and Death Gliders, boss. So they were outnumbered at least 4-1. Tilda, what else is new? Tilda, the enemy fleet entered weapons range, but did not open fire. Tilda, what are they waiting for? Tilda, alas, the ball was in the Terran's court, so there was nothing for them to do but wait. 'Tis Superior Bridge, 05.03.2022, 1315. The commander of the 7th Fleet let the Tory wait for 2 reasons. He wanted to get his ships in position, and he wanted to get on his enemy's nerves. He noticed that the enemy had split their forces in 2, forcing him to do the same. Tilda and the position of the smaller fleet above Antarctica to draw us within range of the ancient outpost. Whoever is in command, they are smart. Tilda. But the numbers were on his side. And the Terran Imperial ship Superior was the most advanced ship in service. Tilda, time to begin. Tilda, he gave his communications officer several orders, then stepped onto the holocommunicator platform. There was a hum as the device engaged, and the transmission was sent out. Stargate Command Briefing Room 05.03.2022, 1317. The briefing room had been converted into a combat information center. Brigadier Carter was talking to one of the technicians when the air in the middle of room rippled. Carter recognized it as an Asgard holographic projection, but that was not the problem. The problem was the person being projected. Tilda, are you kidding me? We killed this guy. Like really killed this guy. Tilda, he was wearing a solid black uniform with 5 stars on his shoulders. 3 were gold and 2 silver. I am Grand Admiral Apophis, commander of the 7th Fleet. Are you kidding me? Didn't we kill this guy? President Quinn said, like several times over. The Joint Chiefs had wanted him to stay in the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, which was a very secure bunker located deep underneath the White House. But he had beamed from the Piak to Stargate Command several minutes before they had gone to DEFCON 1. Carter was busy in the makeshift CIC, so the president was using her office. When he had heard the sound of the holographic project, he had come to see what was happening. Grand Admiral Apophis ignored him and kept going. Surrender now, or we will burn you world to ashes. Carter and Quinn exchanged looks. The president stood in front of the Grand Admiral. No. Very well, you have chosen your fate. The hologram faded away. Quinn knew that now it was only a matter of time before the shooting started, but he also knew that there had been no other possible answer. Tis Superior Bridge, 05.03.2022, 1320. Apophis had stepped off the holocommunicator platform. Tilda no. Tilda it had been a short and clear answer. Tilda nothing like what the files said. Tilda his superiors had provided him with a report on President Quinn. They had thought that Quinn would be weak and slow to act. But instead, he had put his foot down and made it clear where this version of Earth stood. And he had no doubt that the Tory would put up quite the fight. Tilda time for Phase 2. Tilda meaning the destruction of the enemy fleet, which would be followed by a ground invasion. He turned to the weapons officer and gave the order to open fire. But as the fleet unleashed its first salvo, they were unaware that this battle had attracted attention from somewhere else. But for now, these interested parties were merely watching. USS Spira Bridge, 05.03.2022, 1321. Spira was firing everything she had. Between her energy weapons and the nuclear missiles, she was doing a considerable amount of damage, but it was only a matter of time before she took some of her own. To her port side, Trya and Chaser were unleashing salvos of energy bolts to take out anything that came through. Nice shooting, people, Vale said. Keep it up. Laura Cadman was manning the weapons console. She fired the energy weapons at a wave of death gliders, while Calhoun unleashed more missiles. As 2 of the gliders exploded, a group of 8 F-302s engaged the rest. The squadrons had launched minutes ago, but it had taken time for them to get into range of the enemy. Tilda go get them, Cameron. Tilda SG-1 had wanted to join in on this fight, but General Kersey had said no. Instead, he had assigned Colonel Mitchell to command the Prometheus fighter wing. The rest of the team had been sent to the Antarctic outpost to defend it from Terran ground forces. T-Zalo, give me maneuver Alpha 3. Yes, sir, T-Zalo said. The ship was hit by several large bolts from a nearby Haddock-class ship. There were sparks and alarms as the ship took stock of the damage. More bolts were launched towards them, but now the ship was dodging and weaving as Vale had ordered, so these bolts failed to connect. Vale was about to order another maneuver, but T-Zalo beat him to it. The turn lined the Spira up to provide cover fire for the Korolev, which was attacking a pair of enemy capital ships. Calhoun unleashed the remaining missiles, eliminating the Elkesh protecting those ships. This allowed the Korolev to hit the Haddock-class ships with her Asgard beams. Cadman unleashed a salvo of energy bolts, further damaging the targets. Alas, the Terrans returned the favor. Weapons down to 80%, shields at 90, Alec Coulson said from the engineering console. If you have a clever plan, now would be the time. Maybe. T-Zalo, how far are we from the moon? 4 minutes at full sublight, sir. Then you know where we're going. Alec, they'll chase us. So, turn off the forward units and divert all the power to the rear firing guns. That's the plan, Vale said. Colonel Cadman, make them hurt. Yes, sir, Cadman said. Spira bolted towards the moon as fast as she could, and like Vale had said, the Terrans followed. So she began firing her weapons for all she worth. Tis Superior Bridge, 05.03.2022, 1325. Apophis watched as one of the Tory ships bolted towards the planet's moon, and 2 of his Haddock-class ships followed, along with all their support ships. Tilda, what are they up to? Tilda, according to the intelligence files he had been provided, there were no Tory outposts on this moon. But what worried Apophis was the fact that he had not been provided any information on the colonel in command of Spira. This, Mark Vale, was a complete mystery to Imperial intelligence, and attempts to find his counterpart in the Terran universe had failed. It was ship commanded by a ghost. Helmsman, pursuit course after target Beta 3. Yes, sir, the officer manning the helm said. Superior pulled away from the main fight and started shooting at the ghost ship. But whoever was flying that ship was no slough, because not a single bolt managed to connect. As they chased their target, Apophis looked around the bridge. The room was square, with an elaborate throne in the middle. This lavish seat was the command chair. The room had originally been completely gold, but ancient and wraith consoles had been added. Also, there were Terran add-ons attached to the gold consoles. His study was ended when the weapons officer spoke up. Sir, the enemy vessel is... That was as far as the man got before the ship was hit. No damage to shields, Grand Admiral. Deploy the death gliders. He had kept the flagship's gliders in reserve, just in case. But now was a good time to deploy them and deal with whatever the ghost had in mind by destroying his vessel. Try a bridge 05.03.2022, 1328. The Elkesh that Trya had been exchanging fire with exploded. In a matter of minutes, the lines had vanished and the battle had become a chaotic scramble. It was a mix of dogfighting and ships trying to broadside one another, with some submarine fighting added for good measure. But despite all the chaos, Yin still noticed that the Spira was bolting towards the moon, and that the Terrans were following. What the hell is Vale doing? He asked, not really expect an answer. There were no outposts on the moon, and Colonel Vale knew that. Tilda, so why is going there? Tilda, one thing was sure, the colonel was not running. Yin had read the colonel's service file and psych profile. Tilda, running is not what he does. Tilda, his tactic had allowed Spira to divert all her power to the aft weapons, which had ended 4 Elkesh and 7 death gliders. Meanwhile, the Trya and Chaser were helping the Korolev in her fight as best as they could. But all 3 ships were taking a beating, and so was the rest of the fleet. Tilda timed to come up with a clever plan, Tilda checking the sensors, he saw that the ships above Antarctica were in the same pickle. So luring them towards the Antarctic outpost was not an option. As for the outpost, it was shooting anything it could. But the chaotic nature of the battle was making it impossible for the outpost to really cut loose, which was probably exactly what the Terrans were hoping for. Tilda, they probably know what the outpost did to Anubis fleet back in the day. Tilda, fortunately, this was when the Terrans found out the hard way that Colonel Vale had already come up with a clever plan. USS Spira Bridge, 05.03.2022, 1329. Spira had reached the moon, with the Terrans following them as Vale had hoped. Tilda, okay, this either works or blows up in my face. Tilda, alas, there was only one way to find out. He hit several buttons on the control panels next to his chair. That done, he turned his chair to face Alec Carlson. "Tilda, here we go." "Tilda." "Alec, engage FTL modules 1 and 4 at 12%. T-Zalo, roll us 20 degrees to port." "What, Carlson?" "We're inside a gravity field engaging the FTL drive." Carlson realized what Vale was up to and swallowed the rest of the sentence. As T-Zalo rolled the ship, he pressed the buttons to execute Vale's orders. The computer objected, but he overrode the safeties. Then there was a beep as the modules engaged as ordered. The first thing to happen was that Spira's shields and inertia control system kept the ship from being torn apart. This had been the biggest hurdle for the plan to overcome. Next, 2 particle waves erupted from the FTL drive modules. The particles bolted from the ship and interacted with the moon's gravity field, and this was where things had gotten technical. Vale was a soldier, not scientist, but even he knew about Einstein and relativity, and that the moon's gravity field distorted the spacetime continuum. On any normal day, this effect was minuscule and harmless. Had Spira been fitted with a normal hyperdrive, this was exactly how things would have remained. But the Markroman 2 faster-than-light drive was a very different animal. As the gravity field and the particles mixed, a distortion began to form. At first, it did not appear very threatening. However, the distortion trailed behind the ship like a banner being towed by a plane. This meant that it was mixing with wake from the sublight drive, causing the energy levels to rise. And once they were high enough, "'Tis superior bridge, 05.03.2022, 1334. Apophis watched as spacetime distorted behind the Ghost's vessel, tearing the Superior's death gliders apart like they were made out of tissue paper. And they were not the only ships to be destroyed. Every other death glider chasing the Spira was eliminated. All but 2 Ulkesh lost their shields, allowing the enemy to blast them to pieces. The last 2 Ulkesh lost their engines and ended up colliding with one of the Haddock-class ships. Its shields failed and the distortion hit it head-on. The sublight drives failed and it kept going, straight into Earth's gravity well. With no way to slow down, it was quickly turned into a fireball as it passed through the atmosphere and ended up exploding. Tilda, and so the slaughter begins. Tilda, as for the last Haddock-class ship, its shields took a major pounding from the distortion. Then the Spira disengaged her FTL drive and pulled away from the moon. "Tilda, what are you up to, Ghost? Tilda." The answer came in the form of a full salvo fired at the remaining ship. Its shields were apparently not in good shape, because it only took a few shots for them to collapse. Then, all the enemy had to target places where they could create secondary explosions, which was exactly what they did. Seconds later, the ship exploded. This left the Superior alone with the Spira, and Colonel Vale did not waste any time attacking right away. "And so the duel begins," Apophis began. "Weapons officer, open fire." The man nodded and did exactly that. USS George Hammond Bridge, 05.03.2022, 1335. While the Tria and Spira were fighting their own battles, the George Hammond and the rest of First Fleet were fighting the Second Battle of Antarctica. Between the 5 304 that made up the fleet and their 5 squadrons on F-302s, the fleet was doing a lot of damage to the Terran Armada. At the same time, the Antarctic outpost was shooting down death gliders and Ulkesh left and right. John Shepard would have preferred to get into a F-302 and get into the nitty-gritty of the fight. But because he was a brigadier now, he would have been forced to settle for operating the Hammond's weapons. He had just destroyed an Ulkesh when the Hammond was hit by a rain of weapons fire from 3 Haddock-class ships. "Crap," he turned to Kevin Marks, who was flying the ship. "Shields. 50% and falling fast. Turn her to port. All the power to the forward Asgard beams." "Yes, sir." Marks swung the ship around, while one of the engineers diverted the power to the forward weapons as ordered. Shepard managed to fire the weapons 5 more times, but then there was an explosion somewhere behind him. The console screamed at him, making it extremely clear that the Asgard beams were offline. The good news was the Hammond had managed to do major damage herself. The first 3 shots had hit one of Haddock-class ships. Shots number 1 and 2 had taken down the shields, with the 3rd shot hit the hyperdrive core. This had been a kill shot that also damaged the ship next to it. That ship had been at the receiving end of shot number 4 and 5. Its shields also collapsed, but then the 3rd vessel fired an ancient drone and took out the Asgard weapons. Before Shepard could curse, 3 F-302s and 2 puddle jumpers flew past and opened fire on the now unshielded ship and destroyed it. Tilda better. Tilda, he had barely completed the thought when the last capital ship fired more drones. More explosions rocked the Hammond. "We just lost the sublight drives," one of the engineers yelled. "Confirmed, sir," Mark said. At that moment, the Daedalus and the Apollo attacked the Terran ship with their forward Asgard beams. The good news was that the ship exploded. The bad news was that the blast sent out a shockwave that hit the Hammond. Her shields strained as the ship spiraled down towards the planet. It would only be seconds before they hit the surface, and there was nothing anybody could do about it. The George Hammond was about to become the first Tory victim of the Second Battle of Antarctica. 19. The War/Lucia Prime. Lucia Prime, the Cave 05.03.2022. 1310. President Morris watched as the 2 groups of dots met. The numbers were not in the Alliance's favor. There were 3 Haddock-class Terran ships versus 1 Alliance warship. So Morris was not surprised when she saw that the Maverick ended up taking a pounding. Commanded by Captain Eric Farrell, it was one of the new ships that had been built after the fall. As for the skipper, Farrell had been an accountant. He had been made captain for the simple reason that there had been nobody else for the job. He had tried to turn down the job, but his daughter Clara had made him take a tour of the ship, and when he had seen how desperate the crew was, he had decided to take it. That had been in March 2020. He had spent the time between then and now turning himself into the best captain he could be. Tilda lost half his weight, trained himself in hand-to-hand combat and marksmanship. Tilda, he had also worked jobs all over the ship, including the dirty ones. It had made him well-liked with his crew. As for his tactical skills, Farrell had led the Maverick through several fights against pirates, but this was his first big engagement. "Tilda, come on, Eric, surprise me and beat these bastards." Tilda, alas, the ship was taking a beating from the Terran invaders, and there was nothing Morris could do about it. Maverick Bridge 05.03.2022. 1315. The shields were down to 80%. Tilda, old girl, is not going to last long like this, Tilda Farrell thought, but he had come up with several plans for things going south for the winter since becoming captain. Tilda, no time like now to put them to test. Tilda Farrell turned his command chair to the engineering console. When he had taken command, the room had been the traditional setup, which meant a helm, a weapons console, and 2 fancy command chair. Farrell had replaced the command chair, which had been more like a throne, with a more simple chair, and added 2 extra consoles. One console was an engineering console, and the other was science. Had Farrell known about Earth technology, he would have called these consoles steampunk. "Joanna, take all the non-essentials offline and shore up the shields." Joanna, who didn't have a last name, was the ship's chief engineer. When Farrell had taken command, the engineering department had been run by a man called Richard Peters. An elderly man, he had been as creative as a brick through a plain glass window. So Farrell had ordered him reassigned and made Joanna the chief. His decision had surprised the crew. This was because Joanna was only 19 years old. But what really made her different was the fact that she had lost her legs in the fall of the Alliance. "That will only get us 11%, boss." I'll take what I can get, he turned to the helm. Sam, put her on course 45 Mark 91 and give me full sublight speed. You do know where that takes us, right? Sam said from the helm, getting him a look from Farrell. Okay, setting the course now. Maverick swung around to the new course, which put her on a collision course with one of the enemy Haddock-class ships. The move had the effect that Farrell had hoped for. He had gambled that the Terrans had orders to conquer the planet, and that was kind of hard to do if you were dead. So the Terrans had moved, which had broken their formation. The problem was that they were still outnumbered. Besides the Maverick, the planet was defended by 12 Elkesh, 17 Teltac, and 40 Deathgliders. While the Maverick was exchanging fire with the capital ships, the Deathgliders and Teltac had been dogfighting their Terran counterparts. Oddly enough, the Terran Elkesh were waiting out the battle. But Farrell was not complaining, because it allowed the Alliance Elkesh to attack the Terran capital ships. The bad news was that the ancient shields were not even dented by their weapons' fire. Sam, set course for those Terran Elkesh. Aye, Captain. The Terrans were up to something, and Farrell had every intention of finding out what. "'Tis Carthage Bridge, 05.03.2022, 1317. Commodore Richard Woolsey was not a happy camper. He had been given only a handful of ships to conquer the remains of the Lucian Alliance. His superiors figured that once he conquered the Alliance homeworld, the remainder would fall quickly. So he had been given only 3 Haddock-class ships. The remaining 7 solar systems would be invaded by a mix of Elkesh, Teltac, Deathgliders, and troop transports. But that would not happen for another hour. And for now, he had to worry about dealing with the Alliance warship. Woolsey hit several keys on his command chair, and a holographic display appeared in front of him. The shields of the Alliance ship were draining fast, but it was headed towards the reserves. Woolsey had ordered the measly 24 Elkesh he had been granted to attack this planet to stay behind. Once the enemy fleet had been destroyed, they would bombard Lucia Prime into submission. But apparently, the enemy had other plans. Tilda time to put a stop to that. Tilda he activate the ship's intercom and gave the order to fire ancient drones. It was time to end this battle. Lucia Prime the Cave 05.03.2022, 1318. Maverick was hit by several ancient drones and exploded, and the smaller ships weren't doing much better either. It was only a matter of minutes before the Terrans finished the fight in orbit and came for the planet. President Morris was already running several scenarios in her head, but none of them were looking very hopeful. She was so busy doing the math in her head that she didn't notice the new group of dots that appeared at the edge of scanner range. The computer that ran the scanners, however, did. It tried to identify the newcomers, but failed. What it did figure out was that the incoming signatures were not Terran or any other profile it knew, so it marked them as unknown, which meant that the dots were yellow. As the last Alliance ship was destroyed, they started moving towards the Terran ships. "'Tis Carthage Bridge, 05.03.2022, 1325. Woolsey smiled as the bombers took up their positions to attack the largest cities on the planet. Tilda and then the real fun will begin. Tilda Imperial Intelligence knew that the Lucian Alliance was a refuge for the colonial resistance movement. Once the Alliance surrender, Woolsey would enjoy hunting them down. "All ships in positions, Commodore," said Captain Aidan Ford. Ford was the second-in-command of the Carthage and the ranking pilot. He had been appointed to this position by Grand Admiral Apophis himself, which was why Woolsey did not trust him as far as he could throw him. "Tilda, it's only a matter of time before he tries to assassinate me." Tilda, but that was a problem for later. For now, he had an alliance to conquer. "Tell them to open fire." "Yes, Commodore." Ford gave the order, and the bombers began their runs. Lucia Prime the Cave 05.03.2022, 1327. The city was taking major damage and panic was taking hold of the ground forces. Because the cave was deep underground, it was relatively safe. But Morris and Archer could hear the radio transmissions from the surface. Tilda taken heaven for the bunkers. Tilda technically, they weren't really bunkers. However, the Alliance had spent the last couple of months reinforcing basements, sewers, and pre-existing caves. There was enough space for a considerable percentage of the population. The rest of the civilians had been evacuated to farms and small settlements outside the capital. Morris was about to give the order to retreat to the ground forces when the short-range sensors beeped. A large cluster of unknown vessels had just entered range. More beeps made it clear that the newcomers had opened fire on the Terrans. "This is either very good or very bad," Archer said. "Only one way to find out," Morris said. Tilda wait and see is not exactly my favorite approach. Tilda, but like she had told Archer, it was the only way to find out. "'Tis Carthage Bridge, 05.03.2022, 1334. Woolsey cursed as another wave of weapons fire hit the shields. These attackers were unlike any ships the Empire had ever seen. The front sections were shaped like bullets, while the rear sections were saucers. A blue oval in the middle of the saucer indicated the presence of a hyperdrive, and there were 2 red grills at the end of the ships. These were the sublight drives. The ships were gold, except for the tips of the forward section. These tips apparently the command centers were silver. As for the weapons fire that they were unleashing, it appeared to be some kind of energy weapons. They had enough punch to destroy the smaller ships, but the Haddock-class ships were unaffected. Unlike the Alliance vessels, however, these ships were maneuverable enough to dodge the fire from the Woolsey ships, and there were dozens of them. "We've lost all support ships," Ford said. "Shield status." "Holding at." That was as far as he got before another wave of weapons fire hit. 97%. Their weapons are ineffective against our shields. We are, and then the enemy switched to missiles. They're through our shields. "How is that?" That was as far as he got before things started exploding. "Lucia Prime the Cave 05.03.2022, 1335. "How did they do that?" Morris asked. For the first time, she looked around the room. The large displays they had been using to monitor the fight were mounted on one wall. Facing it were 3 rows of 5 consoles each. Beyond that was a table with map of the Alliance carved into it. The consoles were manned by military personnel, and the admirals had been using the table to track the status of the invasion as a whole. Admiral Lawson was an elderly man who commanded the western half of the Alliance. Admiral Henderson was a woman in her 40s in command of the eastern half fleet. It was Henderson who answered. "I noticed that each of the newcomers has their energy weapons set to a different frequency," she began. "They are probably comparing the impacts of the bolts on the shields, allowing them to figure out the frequency." "And if those missiles have anti-shield jammers," Archer said, "then all they would have to do is punch that in and fire away." Morris looked back at the screen. Whoever these people were, they had just ruined the Terrans' plans. But what were their plans once they were done with that? "Flagship Command Center, 05.03.1342. Fleet Commander 2K-R11 watched as the enemy capital ships exploded. He turned to his helmsman and gave the order to set course for their next target. The Stragoth's contribution to this fight was over. There was an irony that 2K-R11 ended up saving a planet full of humans. His brother, 2ZV-42, had died while leading an attempt to invade a human world called Earth. Of course, the humans did not know the Stragoth's name. So instead, the Earthers referred to them as mimetic aliens or P3X-118 hostiles. The reason for the later name was because the failed invasion had been launched from a planet the Earthers called P3X-118. They had done so, using a device that many in the galaxy referred as a Stargate. The planet was now off-limits to the Earthers and their allies, with extra security measures preventing further incursions by the Stragoth. Ironically, in making this world-forbidden territory, the Earthers had actually done the Stragoth a favor. Their homeworld, simply called home, was located in the same solar system as P3X 118. Before, the leadership had considered full-scale colonization of the planet too dangerous because of the Stargate. But with the world locked out by the Earthers, they had changed their mind. So for the past 23 Earth years, that was exactly what the Stragoth had been doing, colonizing P3X 118. They had also used a cloning program to increase their numbers and been building a fleet. The original plan had been to use this fleet to defend their planet. But when the Terrans had invaded, the High Command had changed his orders. 2K-R11 superiors were well aware that his fleet of 72 Vengeance-class interceptors was not big enough to wage a full-scale war, which was why his superiors had given him order to execute hit-and-run attacks on small Terran task forces. 2K-R11 had quickly realized that if the invasion of the Alliance homeworld failed, the invasion of the Alliance would collapse. The helmsman informed him that the fleet was ready to jump. He gave the order, and the fleet jumped. 20 The War/Langara. Langara. Facility Alpha Command Room 105.03.2022. 1305. The years since Jonas Quinn had returned home from his stint on SG-1 had been far from quiet. First, there had been the near destruction of the planet because of the use of a Naquadria bomb, which had eventually led to the unification of the planet. But just as this new and improved version of the planet came into being, the Ori had invaded. Fortunately, the Tori had managed to liberate the galaxy from the Ori. But that had not ended the threat to Langara, because the yoke of Ori had been replaced by the menace of the Lucian Alliance. Until the 2010 diplomatic incident with the Tori had provided them the promise of protection, and for 7 years, they had indeed kept the Alliance at bay. Then in 2017, the war with the new Asurans had happened. And with the threat of the Lucian Alliance gone, relations between the Tori and Langara had become minimalistic. Once every very months, the Tori would ask about dialing the 9th chevron, and the diplomatic service would politely say no. At the same time, the Stargate facility had been updated. But that had merely a smokescreen. Because while everybody had been focused on the Stargate and Langara's relationship with the Tori, the planet's political leadership had been making other moves. Sure, the construction of Langara's SGC had been important. But the real game-changer was the fact that ever since the Ori had left in 2006, the Langarans had been retroengineering several pieces of technology they had left behind. And at the same time, they had been scraping together teltaks from all over the galaxy and militarizing them. Instead of buying these vessels in bulk, they had bought one ship every month, and each time from a different source. This had allowed them to stay under the radar of the Tori and other major powers. It had been a slow process, but it had paid off. Because unknown to the wider galaxy, the Langarans now had 15 squadrons of 12 ships each, all of them upgraded with Ori technology. The Langarans had stopped at 180 because they couldn't maintain more ships than that, and the leadership wanted to divert the budget to the retroengineering program. What all of this meant was that the Langarans were ready for the Terrans when they showed up. Of course, a fleet needed a commander. This was where Jonas Quinn entered the picture. During the Ori occupation, it had been Jonas who had set up an underground movement to resist them. It had also been Quinn who had come up with the retroengineering programs and the fleet acquisition plan. The first program was codenamed Operation Da Vinci, named after Leonardo da Vinci, and the second had been named Operation Sword. As soon as they had been approved, Quinn had left politics and gone on to raise a family with Kyan Asir. The two of them had married in 2007 and had 4 children since. Daniel and Teal'c were twins and were both 15. Jonathan, who everybody called Jack, had been born in 2010, and Samantha, the only girl of the 4, had joined the family in 2015. She had been 2 years old when the Lucian alliance had collapsed. It was this event that had brought Quinn out of retirement. Well, what he had thought off as retirement. He and Kayana still had to pay the bills, so they had become teachers at a school in a small town called Suk. He taught history, while she taught chemistry. After a meeting with the Joint Ruling Council, he had been appointed as the first commander of the Office of Planetary Defense. He had overseen the upgrade of the Stargate facility. Codenamed Facility Bravo, it was now a fully fledged Stargate command. The base had been finished in late 2020, but the staff had been a different story. The process of training and selecting them was still ongoing, which was why the base was still inactive. As for Facility Alpha, it was located deep underground and was the Langaren version of the Pentagon. And Command Room 1 was the most secure part of the whole thing. It was a round room with 3 circles of consoles and a round tactical table in the middle. To allow passage to the table, there was a break in the circles with a flight of stairs. The unit had a map of the local system with lights underneath. A pair of cables connected it to the radar systems. The incoming enemy vessels were represented by moving red dots, but there were no friendly dots. "All ships remaining cloaked, General," said Rex Jones. "They are not showing up on our scanners, and there are no signs that the enemy knows they are there, so far." Lieutenant Colonel Rex Jones was in his 30s, with dark skin and short, black hair. On an average day, he was the ranking officer for Control Room 1, which made him the second in command during this situation. Besides Quinn and Jones, there were 36 officers manning the control consoles and 4 security officers guarding the door. "How many hostiles are we looking at?" 5 Haddock class, 20 Elkesh, and 3 troops transports. We're not reading any death gliders, but I'm sure that those capital ships are carrying a full squadron each. Quinn nodded at Jones and looked at the display. "Tilda, here we go." Tilda, he grabbed a telephone receiver that was connected to the table. It was not actually connected to a telephone, but to the facility's central radio transmitter. And so, Major General Jonas Quinn began giving orders. "'Tis Hannibal Lecter Bridge, 05.03.2022, 1305. Admiral Jonas Quinn sat in his command chair. It was a bit weird to invade his own homeworld, but there was no doubt in his mind that this would an easy conquest. According to Imperial intelligence, this version of Langara was virtually defenseless. The Tory had provided them with a couple of railguns and a stockpile of missile launchers, but that was all they had. So conquering this planet would not be a challenge. "Weapons officer, order the ships to Formation Delta 2. "Yes, Admiral," said the officer. As the ships were moving into formation, something impossible happened. Dozens of cargo ships decloaked between the fleet and the planet. Before Quinn could give the order to open fire, the enemy did just that. And so began what history would remember as the Great Langaren Turkey Shoot. Langara, Facility Alpha Command Room 105.03.2022, 1317. Jonas wondered who was in command of the Terran fleet. "Tilda, whoever it is, I'm glad it's not me. Tilda, because the Terrans in the Langaren system were having a very bad day." The Teltacs were armed with gold staff weapons, which had been upgraded with Ori technology. There was also a third weapon built from scratch by the Operation Da Vinci engineers. And all 3 weapons had quickly proved that they could punch through Terran shields. Jonas had already made a mental note to make sure that the press would focus on that. "Tilda, they just saved our bacon. Big time." Tilda, as for the current status of the enemy fleet, the support ships had been wiped out in mere minutes, which had allowed the fleet to focus on the Haddock-class ships. 4 of them had been destroyed, leaving only the flagship. It was attempting to retreat, but the fleet had other ideas. There was a beep from the tactical table as the flagship exploded. The invasion of Langara was over, but there was still a tense silence in the room. All that could be heard was the beeps and rattles of the control consoles. Finally, Colonel Jones spoke up. "Sir, we did it," he paused. It's over." "Loses, Colonel." "Sir," he snapped out of his surprise and worked a control console attached to the tactical table. "None," he double-checked, and a smile formed on his face. "None at all, sir. All 180 ships are still here. Orders." "Order the squadron commanders to." That was as far as he got before Console 4 beeped. "Ed, please tell me that's not what I think it is." First Lieutenant Edwina Ed Rodriguez oversaw consoles 1 through 4, which were connected to the longer-range scanners. There were 8 units, so each console got to control 2. Rodriguez gave the general a surprised look. Quinn had memorized the name of everybody manning the consoles, but he had not told anybody that. "I'm reading another Terran task force on the long-range scanners, but the course projection is not towards us, sir." "Then where are they going?" "Extending course now," Rodriguez said as she worked her console. "I can put it on the table, sir." "Go ahead." Rodriguez pressed several buttons and the image on the tactical table changed. It now showed a map of the wider area with a red line representing the course of the Terran task force. It was pretty clear where the fleet was going. Tilde Free Jaffa space, right for Dakara. Tilde the problem was that it was only a matter of time before the Terrans figured out that their fleet had been wiped out. Tilde, and once they do, they'll send a second wave. Tilde, which meant that they would need the fleet in position to defend Langara once again. But the Free Jaffa were good people. Was he just going stand by and let them get wiped out, when he had the means to do something about it? Tilde decision time, Jonas. What would General Hammond do? Tilde he made his decision and picked up the receiver. Dakara High Council Chamber, 05.03.2022, 1325. The Terrans were coming, and everybody on Dakara knew it. As soon as Braddock had returned from Earth, he had raised the alarm and the planet had begun preparing for the attack. The Free Jaffa nation had assigned a considerable fleet to protect their homeworld. But Braddock was still worried that it would not be enough. The Free Jaffa had spent the last couple of years upgrading their ships, but the enemy had ancient and wraith modifications. So it was a race of technology, not a question of numbers. And there was a fair chance that the Free Jaffa might lose that race. "Master Braddock," a female voice asked. Braddock was alone in the council chamber. The rest of the council was in orbit, commanding Haddock-class ships. But Braddock and one more member of the council were to remain on the surface. That way, if Dakara fell, some of the leadership would leave the planet through the Stargate. This would prevent the Free Jaffa ending up leaderless. Braddock had been selected as the first selected survivors. He was waiting for the second council member to arrive. "Yes," Braddock said. He turned around. The new arrival wore traditional high council robes, but what surprised Braddock was her age. Tilde she is young. Tilde she also did not have a tattoo or a mark on her forehead like most Jaffa did. Tilde there's something familiar about her. Tilde she made the traditional bow as they approach him. "Greeting, Master Braddock. I am Nessa of the Hactile." "Nessa, you look well." The previous Hactile representative Kallel had led a movement to make Braddock the new leader of the High Council after a man called Sedak had died in 2006. It had succeeded. As for Kallel, she had left the council several weeks ago. Years ago, the world of Dar Eshkalan had been home to a Free Jaffa camp, which had been bombed by a Jaffa called Arkad. Afterwards, the planet had been abandoned. But recently, the Free Jaffa had realized that expanding their territory further than their currently reach would be unwise. It would leave their forces spread too thin, especially in the light of the Terran threat. So instead, the The High Council had begun looking for worlds that could be settled or resettled inside their border. Dar Eshkalan was one of the worlds selected, with Kallel leading the local government. This had left the Hactile in need of a new representative. The problem had been that nobody had desired the position. So Braddock was not surprised that Nessa did not appear to be pleased to be here. "You are not pleased to be here." "I did not desire this position. I wished to be a warrior, like my sister." "There are many ways to wage battles, Nessa," Braddock began. "Your words and decisions here are equal to 1,000 warriors. But it..." Before he could finish, the door to the chamber opened and a male Jaffa came in. He gave a piece of paper to Braddock. "The battle with the Terrans is joined." "What can we do?" "I have a plan. Please come with me." Nessa nodded, and Braddock led the way out of the room. Space near Dakara 05.03.2022, 1326. The Free Jaffa and Terran fleets opened fire on one another. For every Terran ship, there were 3 Free Jaffa vessels. But like Braddock had known, the Terran vessel were more advanced. Now it was only a matter of time to see which would come out on top, the technology or the numbers.